Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today we're going to talk about a little something different, and that is specifically how you can look at other creatures in the wild to help you catch more bass. I think if you were to talk to most anglers out there, what they see are some correlations between other animals and how the fish are potentially relating to them. So I've got for you a handful of different animals or birds or creatures to look for that will help you indicate where and when and what you might want to be doing. It is pretty cool to me to see how often you can recognize how active the fish are going to be based on other animal activity. It's something that, what we see is Mother Nature really does kind of go hand in hand. Everyone is doing things and every creature is doing things based on what is either happening with the weather or the season or what other creatures are doing. So that's what we're going to touch on today. Before I get into that, though, I do want to remind you if you're looking for more content from me, check out my members only page. We do 2 additional monthly videos. We have a members only live stream. You can have direct access to me. It's a great way to support the channel as well. So if you want to check that out, you can go to my homepage, click the join button, find out everything you need to know about the members only portion of the channel. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. One thing along the lines that I've seen quite frequently happen just driving to the boat launch is how other animals' activity levels generally dictate how well the bass are going to be biting first thing in the morning. So if I'm driving to the lake and I see a bunch of deer running across the road or deer out in the fields or birds are out chirping, a lot of times what that means is the activity level is high and I'll see that fishing is generally good first thing in the morning. When I get to the lake, some of the things I'm going to be looking for are bird activity levels. So generally speaking, if you've got a population of shad or pelagic type species, forage species in your lake, if you've got loons or seagulls that are actively feeding, those can generally be very, very good places to fish. I don't know that this is any sort of secret. If you see seagulls that are dive bombing or loons that are actively chasing bait fish, generally speaking, what that means is they've got a big ball of bait fish, and therefore, not only are the birds feeding on it, but a lot of times what you'll find are those bait balls are being pushed to the surface based on the fish that are underneath them. Now, it's not always necessarily bass, could be white bass, could be stripers. But if there's bait that's on the surface, there's a good bet that you're going to have some game fish that are feeding on them as well. So, very good places to fish. I mean, if you see it from across the lake, you might want to start up the big motor and run over to them and start casting into the same area that those birds are dive bombing. Now, birds are not only great for finding those, bait balls that are out in the middle of the lake, but if you happen to be going down a shoreline and you see a stretch where you've got a bunch of herons or a bunch of different egrets that are on the bank, so shoreline related birds that are feeding on that bank, there's generally a lot of bait fish and small fish that are in that area that those birds are feeding on. Well, if they're feeding on all of those, you know that there's bass in that area that are feeding on the fish as well. I can't tell you how many times I have found areas on big grass lakes, whether it's up north by me or down in Florida, where you have these lakes that are very, very similar in nature. And you go around, you're fishing around, having a crummy day, and then you pull into an area where you see 5, 6 different shoreline birds that are actively feeding. And all of a sudden, you start getting a lot of bites in those areas. At this point, it's no longer coincidence. Early in my career, it was kind of like, I didn't pay that much attention to it because I didn't think there'd be that good of a correlation. Now I specifically look for shoreline birds. That's how good that pattern can be. So I definitely pay attention to them. But birds are not the only thing to be looking for. Uh, in the springtime, one thing that I'm always looking for is turtle activity. Turtles generally, they go through like a hibernation state if you live up north here. But when water temperatures start hitting that mid 50 range and they really start warming up, you start seeing a lot of turtle activity In shallower water, you see turtles that are sitting on top of logs. They're starting to sun themselves. Well, when that starts to happen, that's a very, very good indicator that bass are going to be starting to pull back into some of those shallower areas, starting to warm themselves, prep for the spawn. So I'll go almost from wintering patterns to more of my springtime patterns just based on seeing that. It's really, again, it's really one of those things that's kind of an eye opening thing that when you start seeing those turtles up shallow, sunbathing where you get a log and there'll be 10 turtles on that log, dude, they're back there, and that means the bass are in those same, not necessarily the same area where the turtle is, but it means the bass are going to be pushing back into that warmer water as well. Remember, turtles are also cold-blooded creatures, so they're also looking for warmer water uh, to be in, because that just brings up their activity levels. So you're talking about bass being in those shallower areas as well. You're talking about areas that are going to be, your good spawning type banks. That's where the bass are going to be. But it's really just a matter of seeing. So I want you to understand, I'm not saying you want to fish where the turtles are. I'm saying you're using the turtles as an indicator that the water temperatures are warming to the point where the bass are now going to be thinking about spawning versus being in their winter time areas. So I definitely pay attention to turtles in that springtime period. So they're a really good one to look for. Another one that I really like is bullfrogs. Or frogs in general. If I'm hearing frogs that are croaking, a lot of times what I've found is that the bass in those areas may be in extremely shallow water. So a lot of times if you hear bullfrogs, you're talking about fish in your marshy areas, your pad-filled areas. Uh, if I'm not hearing any frog activity, that's a little concerning to begin with. But if I'm hearing frog activity, a lot of times I'm going to fish even shallower, so even tighter to the bank or some of that marsh reed. Because what I've found is that where those frogs are, the frogs generally are not out flipping around, jumping around in the pads where we like to throw a hollow belly frog. The frogs are generally up in the marshy grass type areas. Well, a lot of times you're talking about only that much water, but that's also where the bass are, because they're looking for the frogs. They know where those frogs are going to be. So I'm always paying attention to if I'm hearing bullfrogs or hearing frogs that are croaking. If I am, I feel like the bass are going to be up shallow. They're going to be tight to that marsh grass, and they're going to be looking for those frogs. So I'll be willing to fish much shallower than I might be in areas if I'm not hearing frogs. And then the last creature that I want to point out here is one that very rarely becomes an issue, but occasionally I have run into this, and that's if I see otters around. Otters generally are not a good thing for you. So if I'm fishing an area and there's otters that are actively just swimming around and playing around, uh, generally I'll just leave the area. If they're in a bay or a little pocket, I'm not talking about leaving and going a mile away, but a lot of times what you'll find is they're in one little area or going down a bank. Well, if they're going down a bank, I don't want to fish behind them. The reason for that is otters are fantastic fishermen. They will catch a bass, they will catch whatever fish is swimming by and eat it. And I actually feel like it's very rare to catch a fish after an otter has swum through an area. So I'll leave, come back, or get in front of the otters and fish the other way. It's just something that I found that if I've got some otters that are playing around right where I'm at, I don't ever catch any fish. Uh, and mind you, I love otters, so I'll sit there and watch them all day long. But generally speaking, I don't think they're that good for the fish. I think the fish definitely recognize them as a threat, and therefore they go out of a feeding mode into a we got to get out of here mode, or just they shut down and they become much more aware of their surroundings. So that's something to pay attention to. I'd love to hear though from you guys in the comment section. What are some other creatures that you pay attention to? I could throw out that, you start looking at your insect hatches, your crayfish hatches, things like that. They can definitely dictate where the fish are going to be as well. But I'm talking more about like other animal type creatures. I'd love to know what you guys have to say. One other one that I just thought of too, right off the top of my head. So you can go some places and catch bass that are following snakes. So this happens on some areas. that have like good smallmouth populations. And I don't feel like the bass ever really eat the snake, but the snakes will be feeding on certain fish species. And a lot of times I feel like the bass will follow the snake to see where the snake goes to see if they can take advantage of it. So don't be afraid to cast behind a snake. There are some bodies of water that I've seen where that actually can come into play at times. So let me know in the comments section. I'd love to know, what correlations have you guys seen with other creatures to fishing responses, positive or negative? So hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned for another video coming up tomorrow.